All right, that brings us to our final speaker of the breakfast program. I'm really excited to introduce her. She'll be joining us virtually. So I'm going to introduce Linda Darling-Hammond, who is the state board president in California. She's the former president and CEO of Learning Policy Institute, which was created to provide high-quality research for policies that enable equal access to education for every child. She also taught at Stanford's Graduate School of Education. So we're really excited to have her here. And take it away, Linda.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here, at least virtually, and I loved the last speaker. I'm going to build right on what Gerald was talking about. We are at a moment in our history where this conference is so well named, Ed on the Edge, because we're really trying to create this path to school transformation that is so incredibly important. We're at a moment where around the world we've experienced a public health crisis, economic crisis, a climate crisis in the United States and in some other countries, a civil rights crisis that is a long overdue reckoning for the many sources of inequality in our society and in our education system. In addition, we see at moments like this all across the globe in human history that when you have this confluence of forces that cause disruption from old ways of doing things, that we can see very impressive and important generational social changes that can really make a difference in the way that we conceptualize every kind of system in our society. But we need to think hard about how to use this time to actually support systemic change. At the Learning Policy Institute, we've developed a set of guides around reinventing as well as restarting school, and those have been made available to you. And the question that sometimes is asked is, well, why do we really need to worry about reinventing in this moment? And the basic reason is that the current school structures that we have are those that were designed 100 years ago in the period of time where scientific managers were figuring out how we could do mass education in urban settings where people were coming for jobs in their factories and in the mills and other new inventions in the economy. But they were not designed to support strong relationships, the kind of whole child approach we now need, the 21st century skills that are so very different from what people were developing then, the personalized supports, and of course, the equitable opportunities. In fact, when we built the system in the early 20th century, we didn't know then what we know now about how the brain develops and is wired for learning. The system was not designed to develop most learners to unlock their potential. It was built to select and sort, to support that mass education, preparing students for the industrial jobs that no longer exist in our society in large numbers. Based on that factory model, the education system assumed that students' learning could be assembled through standardized transmission of information at different stops along the assembly line, which were grade levels and class periods, and that by creating different tracks along the assembly line for students with different quote-unquote potential, students could be efficiently prepared for their very different roles in life. Not only was the model rooted in the eugenics of the time, in fact, it was the eugenicists that developed the tracking system and the testing system that accompanied it. The idea that race and ethnicity-based differences should guide those tracking decisions, but it also minimized the importance of relationships among people and a child's capacity to develop and demonstrate their potential. This model that we inherited and that we're still trying to evolve doesn't serve us well, economically, ethically, individually, or collectively. And the harms that have been caused by the outdated structures that Gerald just described when he talked about a teacher who said, David, which one is he? You know, caught in that anonymous factory model, leaves so many kids without access to caring adults who know them well. And it's exacerbated by policies that implicitly encourage teacher-centered, transmission-oriented pedagogy. I'm going to have to wait for a second. Here we go. My connection was lost to the slides. So this has created an unequal system. And the anatomy of inequality that we've inherited really starts with the degree of poverty and segregation. We have the highest rates of poverty in the industrialized world for children. We have resegregated schools significantly over the last 50 years. On that, we base unequal school expenditures and resources. That creates an unequal distribution of well-qualified teachers, which feeds unequal curriculum opportunities and sometimes creates dysfunctional schools. And when you think about many of the things we worry about in schools and in classrooms, a lot of them stem from these fundamental systemic forces, which actually create less knowledge base about how to educate kids well in the classroom. And then if you add implicit biases to that, which assume that many kids don't care, are not capable, and reinforce stereotype threat for those kids, we end up with a situation in which the opportunity to learn is really shaped not only by individuals in the system, but also by the system itself. We know that the demand for skills has been changing in recent years. Been a huge increase in the demand for more cognitively complex skills. And at the same time, we've had the reality that the kinds of skills we can test with our current antiquated approaches to testing are the same skills that can be digitized, automated, and outsourced. Knowledge is also expanding. Between 1999 and 2003, there was more new knowledge created in the world than in the entire history of the world preceding. And knowledge is now doubling at least every year or a little faster than that. So we're going to have to prepare kids to use knowledge that hasn't been discovered yet, using technologies that have not been invented yet, solving major problems that we have not been able to solve. And the current approaches to education were built on a very different set of presumptions about what the outcomes were intended to be. Right up the street from me is Google. And they used to use all of the kinds of things we produce from our school system to select employees, test scores and grades and transcripts of various kinds. And when they did a study of how those predicted success in a place like Google, which is really at the cutting edge of the kind of technology and economy we're building, they found that none of those things were predictive. Instead, what they found really matters is something that they've called learning ability. The ability to get into a situation, pose a problem, find resources, work with others to create something, test it out, self-evaluate, continue to improve. That kind of learning ability is what we need to be able to teach to. And it means that we need to be able to teach for those kind of analytic skills, application skills, collaboration, communication, what in a word is what we might call deeper learning. Our challenge now is really to teach for deeper learning and also to teach for diversity and equity. That means that we need to be making changes in the way we think about curriculum, the way we think about assessment, the way we think about educating all the dimensions of the human being, social, emotional, cognitive, and beyond. And we know a lot more about how to do that because we've been accruing a science of learning and development from neuroscience, developmental science, from all kinds of disciplines that helps us understand what we didn't know when we invented the schools we have today. And our job is to harness that knowledge and build the system for the next century that will really allow us to teach in the way that people learn. That includes the fact that the brain is always developing. Even at my age, we can rewire the brain, and it's a function of our relationships and our experiences. It is also true that supportive relationships are the most important element, both for the learning process and to address trauma, which is so much an issue in our schools at this moment. Learning is social and interactive, as well as emotional and academic, and the way we learn is determined by how we feel about that setting, how we feel about ourselves, whether we feel capable, whether we're experiencing stigma or any kind of trauma or discrimination. Students' perceptions of themselves actually influence learning. So if they believe they can't do something, then that will translate into the actual learning process. And children actively construct knowledge by making connections between what they already know and have experienced and what they're learning. And this all happens in a cultural context. So when we talk about culturally responsive teaching, everyone has culture. All of us have a variety of experiences, ways of being, traditions that we use as the basis for learning. And that is also reinforced by learning symbol systems. So things like music and art and languages, which in our system, we've kind of treated as frills, like maybe you'll get them and maybe you won't, are actually part of what builds brain architecture. Physical activity helps to build brain architecture. So if you were in school in a place like Finland, for example, but also many other schools in China and elsewhere, you would be taking music and art from the very beginning in substantial quantity. That's much of what the primary grades focus on. You'd be learning multiple languages, as you do in many countries around the world. In Finland, the kids go out every hour on the hour for 15 minutes. That physical activity also is part of keeping the brain alert. And we need to be thinking about how we would structure schools if, in fact, we were not operating off of the old presumptions that we had in the 20th century. That genes determine who we become, that we can determine that and put kids on a tracking system early on, that we can use this transmission curriculum, that in fact, average stands for the individual, we just teach to the middle, or that we are actually, at the end of the day, trying to structure a way that a few people can demonstrate their talents and everyone else will be presumed to be talentless. In fact, we know that context is what matters, that in fact, deep inquiry into learning is what motivates us and allows us to learn, and that at the end of the day, talent is plentiful, and it is not, in fact, arrayed on a bell curve, which many of our instruments of learning are trying to figure out how to array us on. So schools that were based on learning would look very different than what we've inherited. They would look a lot more like the places where kids are engaged in inquiry, where they're engaged together with each other in pursuing important questions, where the school is much more representative of opportunities for oxytocin, the hormone that helps our brain develop, that also allows us to learn effectively and with less anxiety. Schools where cortisol is not the primary experience that kids have. That is this anxiety and adrenaline that creates the fight or flight syndrome, which 2/3 of kids in secondary schools describe as the major sentiments that they have around schools. So we need to think about a new set of 3 Rs for schools that are relationship-centered, designed for that, that are restorative, where kids are part of a community and reattached to the community whenever there is a challenge that they need to resolve, that they have the tools and the love and surrounding for that, and that they're responsive to the way that kids learn and develop. So what would that school look like? It would have rich interactive learning experiences that include the things I just talked about. It would be very focused on intentional inquiry in support of community goals so that students are engaged in things that they care about, that are meaningful, that make a difference for their lives, their families, their school, classmates, their community, that skillfully integrate that inquiry with explicit instruction, are designed to develop metacognition and cognitive strategies so that we learn how we learn, and then we use that to generate more learning, that provide the opportunity for revising and redoing the tasks that we engage in, which develops the growth mindset that stimulates confidence as well as competence. Rather than give a chapter, give a test, give a grade, it's design a task, engage with that task, learn in a variety of ways about it, produce a product, get feedback about that product in a way that, in fact, makes assessment a gift rather than a punishment, where mistakes are welcomed, where in fact we engage peers and individual students in evaluating their own and each other's work, so they're internalizing those standards, and where we are always using feedback to inform teaching and learning in strategic ways. The goal is ultimately learning, not selecting, sorting, ranking, all of the things that drive the system that discourages so many students. Those environments are identity safe. They tackle the issue of stereotype threat and social identity threat, which occurs whenever any of us hold an identity that is socially stigmatized. That can be in different contexts, a function of race, ethnicity, immigration status, language background, disability status, many other variables can be stigmatized. We carry that as anxiety that actually reduces performance. There's a huge body of research that shows that when we function under a belief that people may see us as not worthy or not competent, we perform much less well. So schools have to be very explicit about making it clear that every student is valued and seen as competent, and seen and given the opportunities for rich and rigorous instruction, and that they're designed throughout all of their experiences to be able to be supported and encouraged in their work. This is something that actually is very transformative, as we've seen in a number of schools that have redesigned themselves. Obviously, we need systems of support that remove obstacles to learning. In our society, we put a lot of barriers between getting help and getting identified and going through processes of evaluation and bureaucratic channels to get access to programs or resources. We need to change that so that we are really in the moment in multi-tiered systems of support through community schools, through extended learning time, transforming the way in which kids get that support. In Finland, when I was there, outside of the elementary classrooms, there was a central area between them where kids would come. There were adults staffing those for the extra help they needed. About 50% of kids in Finland get what we would call special education services in elementary school. They get what they need when they need it, and then they learn those things and they move on. There's almost no one needing special education services in high school because of all the ways in which they're provided along the way. Without that set of bureaucracy and barriers that we often impose. And finally, we need to redesign schools so that they really support those relationships. That means smaller schools and smaller learning communities within schools. It means looping with the same teachers as many countries do, so that people are together for more years. It means teaching teams that share students. It means advisory systems in secondary schools so that every child is seen every day by an adult whose responsibility it is to support their academic, social, and emotional learning, to be a connection point with parents. Anonymous schools will not get us where we need to go. In the course of this work with colleagues around the sciences of learning and development, we've developed a set of design principles for these kinds of schools that draw on the experience of so many innovators in education who've created schools that do all of these things and succeed in ways that the system as a whole typically does not. So we know that it's possible to build these environments. We know that innovative educators have been doing so, but we also know that they run up against the system, that they are unusual because of the fact that the system is not designed necessarily to support them. We need to take heed of these words that a parent in Atlanta, Michelle Ampon, spoke. She said, reprioritize. This is the time to see if something can be different. To reset the system, we have to take a loss, but we can recuperate if we get kids excited about learning again, if we create that positive environment that they need to learn. So that's our mission. And policy is needed to change the system. We can't keep telling teachers and individuals in schools to do these innovative things and expect that those will live on if we don't also take responsibility for the way we organize education. And we're doing a lot of that in California. We're taking this whole child approach. We've revised our school finance system so that it identifies more resources and sends them to districts based on students' needs in terms of poverty, English learning, foster care, homelessness. We've needed to redesign the curriculum and the assessments. We need to do this across the country. So we're focusing on higher order thinking skills and problem solving for the century that we're in and for the system that kids are going into. We need to invest in skilled teachers and leaders. Right now in this state, $3 billion are available now to bring people into the profession without debt, to support their initial entry and preparation in high quality ways, as well as supporting ongoing professional learning. That should be available everywhere. We've got $3 billion as well for community schools in high poverty settings that will wrap around those supports, provide restorative practices. And we've just added a grade for all 4-year-olds in early childhood education. That's only the beginning, but we need to work diligently at the federal and the state level and the local level to take what we know and really bring it into the world that we are trying to create. And I want to close with the words of Maya Angelou, who said, "Do the best you can until you know better, and then when you know better, do better." That is our challenge in this moment.